Alright, so I thought this would be a really interesting and unique idea for a video because I don't think I've ever heard anyone talk about this topic before, but in this video we're going to be talking about and comparing the evolution of buttons on Nintendo handhelds over the years. I know it's a very oddly specific topic. I just thought it'd be a really cool idea. Just a little bit of a side note though, the only handhelds that I'm not talking about, mainly because I don't have any of these, are any of the vintage Game Watch systems. I bring that because I only have the modern ones. Here's the Mario one. Zelda one is over there, in case anyone's wondering. I'm not doing the vintage Game Watch systems. I'm not doing the Game Boy Pocket or the Game Boy Light. The Game Boy Light is due to that being seen as redundancy because I'll be getting a custom-made Game Boy Pocket. I think I'm going to be doing that next month, not this month. And it's going to be a custom modified Game Boy Pocket, which will have a backlit modified screen, IPS mod specifically. So it would just be redundant to have that and a Game Boy Light. So consider that whenever I get around to it, a Game Boy Pocket Light, if you want. Actually, no, back up. The Game Boy Micro, I don't have that because the Game Boy Micro, for those who don't know, which pretty much every Game Boy fan out there ever knows this, the Game Boy Micro actually bombed upon release. It was a financial failure for Nintendo at the time. And it's seen as a very valuable, not just Game Boy, not just Nintendo collectible, but collectible and system in general. It is absurdly hard to find even to this day. Its price is insane. The Nintendo DS, Nintendo DSi XL, Nintendo 3DS, Nintendo 3DS XL, Nintendo 2DS, new Nintendo 3DS, and new Nintendo 3DS XL. I don't have any of those either. I will redo this video when I get around to getting the rest of those, but as it stands right now, I'm just going over the ones that I have in my collection right now. Starting with, like I said, the modern Game Watch, because chronologically, the Game Watch series of handhelds actually predates the Game Boy. I always found it really interesting how pretend this doesn't exist for a little bit, but the game watches that only had these rounder A and B buttons, like the buttons were more of a rubbery silicone kind of texture. I found that really interesting. Like maybe it was probably done intentionally, so like if your fingers got all sweaty, like because you were getting nervous because of how overwhelming the game was, you wouldn't lose your grip, and that's a pretty nice little detail. Although I want to talk about the D-pad right here for a minute. From what I can tell, it's either a recreation or a blatant recycling of the D-pad found on an NES controller. Well, I never had an NES before. I actually have handled an NES controller. I think it was an NES Classic Edition controller, but you know what I mean. But yeah, it looks very similar. I'm not sure if it's blatantly recycled. The plastic, from what I can tell by the texture and the way it sounds, like its clickiness, it seems to be modern, but I've never had an NES, so I can't really tell, to be sure. As a little bit of a side note, aside from the obvious, the fact that it's modern, it has a rechargeable battery, and it's in color, blah, 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 if you want to include this in my collection, my in a retrospective context of LCD games, right there, for the sake of a joke, I guess you can, because if you look into it on a deeper level, the Game & Watch essentially pioneered the whole LCD game phrase. Like that's why the Tiger Electronics LCD games existed, for instance, from what I can tell. Next up, we have the original Game Boy. This is a custom-made Game Boy for those of you who have never seen it before, but I think a lot of people have actually seen it on my channel. It's a... Oh, go away. It's a Deadpool-themed Game Boy, or DMG if you prefer, which, by the way, I think it's up here. Yeah, the DMG stands for Dot Matrix Game, which is really cool. It has a modified backlit screen, which, like I said, that was a mod. It was custom requested and custom built, whatever. I'm talking about the buttons. I was talking about the buttons. Let me get back to that. The D-pad on this one seems especially crunchy, if that makes sense. Like, in terms of the sound it makes when you press it. Again, if that makes sense. I always like the design on the D-pad. Like, in each direction, there's like two lines in each direction. And the A and B buttons have that subtle but almost prominent clickiness to them in terms of both texture and sound. I always found that pretty cool too. And as for the start and select buttons, Yeah, I know that the words start and select aren't actually there, but that's primarily because of the awesome piece of artwork taking up the front. And by the way, there's a piece of art on the back as well. They're rubbery in terms of texture. That's actually a running theme that you'd see on every Game Boy up until the Game Boy Advance SP, which I'll be getting to that when I get to that. And like I said, skipping both the Game Boy Pocket and the Game Boy Light because I don't have either of those. Moving on to the fan favorite Game Boy Color. The D-pad and the A and B buttons became a lot more prominent, a lot more bulbous when the Game Boy Color came out. Actually, I think specifically the A and B buttons became a lot more prominent and a lot more bulbous on the Pocket originally, but they just didn't have the letters A or B on them. Somebody please correct me in the comments because I am so confused right now. But yeah, like they're a lot more prominent, and the start and select buttons, they're straight as opposed to diagonal, like crooked. Actually, two more facts before I switch to the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Color isn't just a Game Boy in color. It has a faster processor and it has more memory, for those who don't know. But yeah, moving on to the Game Boy Advance. Specifically, my custom-made Game Boy Advance. Yes, I have a lot of custom-made systems. Here is my very first custom-made Game Boy Advance. And in case anyone was guessing by the color scheme, yes, it's a reference to Iron Man, which is also why the Invincible Iron Man is pretty much almost always in the cartridge slot. It's not in there right now. The A and B buttons seem to be pretty much identical to the color. I'm not sure if they're reused. And the start and select buttons are rounded, like they're really small rounded buttons. And the words are right next to them. I always thought that was pretty clever. But aside from the actual design, like the shape of the Game Boy Advance itself, one of my favorite things was always how the shoulder buttons were handled. Pardon me, I have a little bit of the hiccups. Like, not just in terms of the texture, which, by the way, I forgot to point this out, but the texture on the Game Boy Color and, by extension, Game Boy Advance buttons, both clicky and squishy at the same time, if that makes sense. But back to the Advance's L and R buttons. I always liked how they have this kind of bump at the back. I don't know why. It just gave it a lot more prominence to me. Is that just me? Moving on to the Game Boy Advance SP. I have a very special Game Boy Advance SP. The Game Boy Advance SP, historically and canonically, was the very first Game Boy to ever have a rechargeable battery. I'm sorry about that. And this is another custom-made Game Boy, like I said earlier. If you couldn't already tell by the color scheme, it's a direct reference to Johnny Atma, best known by his username, the Gunmetal Guy. It was made in honor and respect of him because he's just a fantastic individual, fantastic musician. He's just overall fantastic. But back on topic, Game Boy Advance SP. The buttons seem to be a lot more flattened, a lot more sleeker, if that makes sense. And we're back to the earlier placement of the buttons. D-pad being right here, A and B being right here, start and select being at the bottom. Although now we have the brightness toggle switch, which, by the way, since this is an IPS modified Game Boy Advance SP... Oh, hold on. That keeps happening for some reason. Point this out. Hold on. 10 brightness levels. 10 brightness levels. Not kidding. And regarding the shoulder buttons, they seem to be integrated into the design of the Game Boy Advance SP itself. Like, it's really cool how clever they were integrated into the system's design. Like, that was always really cool. And skipping the Nintendo DS because I have an original DS as of this recording, and moving instead to the Nintendo DS Lite. Nintendo DS Lite is my favorite of the original DS era, and I say original DS era like I'm talking about before the DSi and the DSi XL, if that makes sense, which, by the way, DSi is over there. But I essentially see this as a direct evolution from the Game Boy Advance to the DS Lite in the context that it resembles the Game Boy Advance SP except it's just wider, if that makes sense. The buttons, the A, B, and now the X and Y buttons, they're bulbous like they were on the original, like, the Game Boy Color or the Advance, etc. Although they're not as big as they were on those consoles anymore, which is, that makes sense. That's to be expected with the evolution of technology. And the D-pad, it doesn't have the engraved symbols for the inputs on each side. Instead, it's a completely flat D-pad that has just straight lines that represent each direction, it's pretty efficient. It's pretty efficiently designed. And the start and select buttons, they're back to being underneath the buttons as opposed to being they're back to being underneath something, but instead of the D-pad, they're underneath the A, B, X, Y face buttons, which is still pretty cool. And the L and R buttons are very much integrated into the design the same way that the SP had its L and R buttons integrated into the system's design. Moving on to the DSi, pretty much the same thing. The only actual changes would be the addition of the power button and how the L and R buttons have cameras integrated into their physical design. Like you can see cameras engraved into them. Hopefully it shows up on the camera. Because the DSi has cameras. One right here and one right here. Now moving on to the new Nintendo 2DS XL specifically. That's the only 3DS in general I have as of this recording. It needs to be repaired. It's probably going to be replaced because I've asked around and I haven't ran into anyone who's actually able to fix it. Not someone who doesn't want to fix it. It's just like it's a very strange issue. But the original 3DS didn't have the C-Stick. It didn't have Amiibo support, although you can't actually see that. And it didn't have the ZL and ZR buttons. But we are jumping from DSi to 3DS, pardon me. But yeah, we have the circle pad, which is basically, think a flat analog stick, and that makes sense because, a DS and or 3DS system opens and shuts, so that makes sense in context. And the C-Stick, basically a second analog stick. Think the same way that the PlayStation has two analog sticks underneath the buttons in the D-pad, if that makes sense. Start and select buttons are back over here. Well, they're still over here if you want, if we're talking from the DSi to the new 2DS XL, whatever. Although the home button is right here, and other 3DS models, including the new models, well, they're not still being released. I mean, we're right here. Very interesting design choice. And as I mentioned, the ZL and ZR buttons. It's basically a 3DS that has enhanced controls, and actually, much like the Game Boy Color that I mentioned a few entries back, it actually does have a really fast processor. And the obviously aforementioned when I put this thing in the shot, the Amiibo thing, whatever, the Amiibo compatibility, pardon me. And that leaves us with the Nintendo Switch Lite. A funny story. I actually kind of predicted that Nintendo was going to release a portable exclusive version of the Switch. Like, I actually intentionally waited things out because knowing the way Nintendo operates, I knew and predicted they were going to release a portable exclusive Switch. But yeah, pretty much the same control scheme-wise, except we have actual analog sticks right here. And the home button is over on this side, and on this side is the screenshot/screen capture button, which, by the way, it records the past 30 or 60 seconds of whatever game you were playing in real time. ZL and ZR buttons, they're a lot more prominent because they're bigger because they're directly behind the front trigger buttons, LR. And start and select were replaced entirely with plus and minus. They do serve the exact same function, but I was more or less confused the very first time that I saw them make this change. I'm not disappointed or mad or anything like that. Like, that'd be silly, let's be honest. I was just really surprised, kind of caught off guard, if that makes sense. So yeah, in case anyone wants to know, if I were going to rank them in some kind of tier list fashion or whatever, I don't really have an opinion in that context, but I can tell you what my top favorites are in context. The DSi, because of, I guess primarily because of how a lot more efficiently designed it is, even more so than the DS Lite, actually. Like, it's actually, what was it, 12% lighter than the DS Lite? And, you know, the addition of being able to, well, at the time, being able to download and play games from the DSi shop. I miss the DSi shop. You still can download and play music via an SD card, which, come on. I have an SD card in there. Obviously, the cameras. Just an overall better experience, in my opinion. I know a lot of people, myself included, ironically enough, do dearly miss the ability to play Game Boy Advance games, but hey, it's what the DS and the DS Lite are for, you know what I mean? In second place, we have the Game Boy Advance. I know I'm cheating, maybe even being hypocritical in context by some capacity, but next up would be the Game Boy Advance SP, primarily because it was the very first of its kind to actually have a rechargeable battery and a backlit, or frontlit if you have an AGS-001 screen at the time. Like, that wasn't a standard. I know the Game Gear had a backlit screen, but, like, we're talking specifically Nintendo stuff here. And even though I play it a lot, the Switch Lite is, it's kind of behind on that list too, but, like, it mainly depends on what game I'm in the mood to play, basically. Like, I don't dislike either of these at all. So yeah, just thought this would be a really interesting and creative idea. Thank you guys for watching. This is Sir Bop-A-Lot, signing out.